Maximilians is featured as someone who was key in those early struggles of women. Yet, the reveal for me in that narrative was the fact that the conclusion drawn then was that her work was inconsequential. So it's evoking the minor on the other hand, but at the same time, an assessment of her work as having been inconsequential. That's where I thought of the idea of a residue. That on one hand, we evoke her as someone who was instrumental in the formative years of protest politics, but our assessment, that is the feminist literature assessment at that time, would conclude that her work was inconsequential. So it is that dialectic, that tension between significance and minor, magical, less significance, impact. Now there, I think as much as one would want to conflate the two, there is substantive difference between marginal, minor, consequence, and inconsequence. So what that did for me was to direct my attention to language and semantics. That there is a political discourse that allows for an easy slippage from one form of understanding to another without it being interrogated. And perhaps the slippage in feminist literature of the 80s would have arisen out of that kind of inability to critique that kind of formulation. It's easy to fall into deterministic kind of sloganeering without interrogating the foundational semantics. And here I'm drawing from my linguistic minor subject I did at UWC. So the idea of the minor kept coming in my thinking around this lecture. That for one to begin to make sense of how political discourses operate, there is a deep investment in the ideas that get generated, but understanding very well how language permits certain kinds of formulation while suspending others. So it was in that context that one went back to the literature on women's studies and what it had given as a kind of starting point to Maximilians. So I've noted the ontological problem that this conclusion would have drawn, that it would have cemented Maximilians' fate had it not been a critical approach to Maximilians. The conclusion that said her work was inconsequential may not have been correct, but it was being attentive to that statement to say there's something to work on with here. Even though she is characterized as minor, marginal in terms of impact, but there's something to revisit to that question. I heard, Nancy, the idea of revisiting certain kind of formulated questions. What does it mean to return to some of those questions? And I think I want to reiterate the fact that for me, to be able to engage with Charlotte Maximilians, it was returning to those questions, but not wanting to affirm founded foundations, but to kind of revisit with a listening eye, a listening ear, and an open eye. So what I took out from the 80s literature was the question of value judgment. And this value judgment resurfaced in 2012 in my research. Just a few months after having graduated, I received an invitation from Universidad, which was at that time was organizing a conference that marked the centenary of the African National Congress. A title of the conference was 100 Years of the ANC, Debating Liberation Histories, which was a critical examination of legacies of liberation struggles. In that conference, I presented a paper titled Charlotte Maximilians, a celebrated and a neglected figure. It was that kind of incorporation of Maximilians in meta-narratives, but at the same time, her marginal status. Her marginal status at that time, I could see that in terms of the name, there was so much that was being known about her, but the extent of her involvement was hidden. That's where my interest was even beginning to build around this figure. That she is celebrated, but there's very little substantive engagement with her thoughts, with what she contributed to the struggle. Now, from that minor reference, I detected in women's struggles, research on Charlotte Maximilians has since developed and influenced interesting debates. The one that I wish to cite was a media article that was published by Atambile Masola, one of the young, kind of energetic, kind of researchers, feminists, who was, in a way, interpreting the meanings of celebrating Maximilians, because that was the time when the president of the country had dedicated the whole year 2021 as the year of Charlotte Maximilians. And Atambile engaged with the meanings, possible meanings embedded in this celebration of Maximilians. And that has produced a series of interventions beyond the media. The story of Charlotte Maximilians, as Heidi was alluding here, had made interventions in the art, in history, in politics, and in the sphere of the public conversations to do with notions of liberations and notions of freedom. Now, the issue I raise in this lecture emanates partly from a deep investment in my engagement with histories of freedom struggles. Reflecting on freedom struggles, I take cue from Robin Kelly's work, Freedom Dreams, who argues that, judging by the visions that social movements set, and also considering the fact that the basic social structure that this movement set out to change remains pretty much the same. And then in that context, Kelly argues that, judging by the visions the movement set for themselves, all social movements have failed. However, it is the visions that continue to inspire a new generation of social activists and thinkers who continue fashioning visions of freedom. So the idea of visions of freedom continues to, would have outlived even the movements that would have kind of instigated them. And once again, here for me was a return to a question. This constant return, I argue, does not settle the debate, but continues to open it into new possibilities. It is in that context of revisiting an old, what seems an old and dated question, that perhaps we can begin to fashion new visions of freedom struggles. Also flowing from a minor reference to Charlotte Maximilians in the narratives of resistance, my inquiry into her life once again presents this recurrent question on public intellectuals. The idea that was advanced by Antonio Gramsci was that all men are potentially intellectuals in the sense of possessing an intellect and using it. But not all are intellectuals by social function. This is a dictum. What has now become a dictum, right, in debates about public intellectuals. Now this debate has become one of those questions that won't just go away. It keeps coming back, and each return offers a different iteration of the question of intellectuals. And it is in that space for me that I was able to really see how Charlotte Maximilians is kind of ejected from the domain of thought. That conceptions of intellectuals that have been advancing histories of intellectuals do not, in a way, allow for a rethinking of intellectuals. That if we accept the dictum without interrogating its meanings, its layered meanings, we are more likely to continue to write women such as Maximilians out of the domain of thought. And sometimes these questions are kind of viewed as trivial questions or secondary to the main debate. Now, if you were to think about the main debates about public intellectuals, categories of intellectuals, what does it mean to do intellectual work? But actually, the last one has been less of a focus in the debate. The actual act of doing intellectual labor. And it is by attending to that question of what it means to actually do the hard work of doing intellectual labor that has the potential to agitate and instigate the debate once again, and also beginning to fashion, I see it beginning to fashion practices, a new sensibility that would begin to build practices around the whole kind of what has been established as the vacation of intellectuals. I'm going to hold on with that until that concept is exhausted also, the vacation of intellectuals. So what it means to instigate a new practice that redefines that vacation. For I think without us redefining that terrain and allowing for those contestations as to what it means to be intellectual, that has been exhausted, but what does it mean to actually do the hard labor of intellectual? To clarify this point, I draw once again to a question that I raised in a paper I delivered in the Winter School of 2018, which is titled, "What is left of public intellectuals?" And I think in that paper I was grappling with this question of what it means to do intellectual labor, but framed in the question, what is left of public intellectuals? Which was a recapitulation of contemporary debates on public intellectuals. The paper examined conceptions of intellectuals, and in that examination, I found that iterations of the debate of public intellectuals have offered understandings of different types of intellectuals. That is Gramsci's organic and inorganic intellectuals. A question that is taken up in the work of Edward Said in his representations of intellectuals, which highlight the shifting terrain of the intellectual in the American context. Of course, that's where Said articulates this question, that you have a shifting terrain where intellectuals could no longer be restricted in the sense that Gramsci had kind of raised the question. That you now had a whole range of specialists, technocrats, who were also expanding that space of becoming specialists in various spheres, in the service of the state, in communications, in military, in sciences. So the question of intellectuals gets more complicated for Said. Now these are some of the conversations that have been shaping my thinking. I've been engaging with these thinkers as to really, why is it that we don't have a conception of women as thinkers who contribute to the production, circulation of ideas in society? Why is it that we don't have that? And I've been really grappling with this from within the established traditions. And this directed my attention to a recurrent theme in liberation struggles once again, because when you think of the positioning of women in society, that extends to various spheres, intellectual debates, marginalization of women in narrations of the liberation struggle. Now, by following a number of statements made with respect to the marginalization of women within the ANC, one notices the ejection of women from the domain of thought, even within the ANC itself. That you don't get a sense of women, and yet when one revisits the archive, and I'm fortunate, thanks Sinazo, NIHEX there I have the luxury of being in proximity of collections of a liberation movement. So I'm able to go and see who was doing what when. And in those records, there are a number of women who did a great deal of thinking freedom struggles, and not liberation, freedom struggles in the context of resistance against apartheid. So there's a texture of the archive that does not reach public conversation, that remains locked in archival material. When one visits those archives, one gets a sense of the evolution, if you like, of the woman question from within the liberation movement that was taken up by women themselves. They were occupying the domain of thought. But where are their histories? One asks. So it goes back to this idea of the idea that in articulations of these issues that women were raising, there is a constant return to the idea that women are perpetual minors and are never thought of as thinkers who contribute to the creation or circulation of ideas in society. Now, in my earlier encounters with the debate on intellectuals, I merely stated this problem, that women are marginalized, and that is not sufficient. It's one thing to state the obvious, right? It's one thing to state the obvious. Now, that statement of marginalization of women is taken up in the book by Zubeida Jeffer on the life and times of Charlotte Käte, which for me really emphasizes, is emphatic on the point of the marginalization of women, but wanting to bring in women, you know, to kind of put them out of the marginal status, to begin to say, however, we did have women such as Charlotte Käte. That, for me, still is not sufficient, right? Now, I am waiting in anticipation to hear how the life history of Charlotte Käte is reinterpreted in the theatrical production of Uganda Puppet. For so far, all these intellectual interventions, the thesis that founded the basis for opening up the debate was a mere documentation, account, and a critiquing of an established tradition. But where to from that? Zubeida Jeffer's book, incorporating Käte into a narrative about representation of women. And I am yet to hear Sipokazi and the team, your take on the story of Charlotte as you are beginning to work with the texture of that story in a theatrical production. The pressure is on, I trust you though. I know, just thinking. All these projects developed from a minor reference. I want to be emphatic about that. All what I've just accounted for now is based on that initial reference to someone who is presented as a marginal figure in terms of accounting for what people who were impactful, people who had made an impact in society. But Käte is counted in a minimalist term that she was insignificant. And yet, what we are now beginning to find, it's not the opposite, right, of saying she was a major, but understanding how histories have evolved in and around her in a manner that ejected her from the domain of thought. For I believe much of Käte's strength, people were commenting here yesterday that she was an artist, she was this, the multiplicity of Käte's public performance, interventions, you know, agitations in various spheres of society, which for me at times, one can be critical and hard to say Käte has been marginalized, has been erased. But I think that for me, that observation kind of takes me to a different terrain, which is yet another aspect of the lecture, to do with aspects of the scholarship in humanities. What the story of Charlotte Maximilians does for me is that it highlights areas of scholarly inquiry that are often cited but never pursued in historical studies. There's a punctuation of a question about Maximilians, but which is never pursued, right? We acknowledge her as having been an influential figure, but we're incapable. I think it's the design of the disciplines themselves that does not allow for that kind of engagement. What I want to refer to as those aspects of human experience which are rendered unthinkable in our disciplines. Partly the problem with Maximilians is that she is an excess in disciplines. Our disciplinary formations are incapable of handling a figure of the late 19th century with such an excess of human experience that could not be handled within the disciplinary formations that kind of institute academic inquiry. I want to think of this in the context of South Africa. You think of the questions that animate the questions that animate studies in anthropology, for example. Charlotte Maximilians exceeds that script. She exceeds the script of native docility, which was a precondition that which ushered in academic inquiry in anthropology in South Africa. So her excess, in a way, there's something to work with in terms of understanding that dynamic, that perhaps when we think of reconfiguring our knowledge projects, there's something about human experience that exceeds those kind of foundation of our knowledge projects. And I think in so many ways, the power embedded, the soft power, I want to think of it, the soft power of the story of Charlotte Maximilians allows us to get to those areas. And without that being said, the project of Mama Maximilians reorients our understanding of our disciplines, then taking us beyond the disciplines, right? So the project of Charlotte Maximilians goes beyond disciplinary formations. There's no way that one could have handled Charlotte Maximilians within one discipline only. So it was through cross-referencing from a range of formations that one is able to grapple with this kind of very rich script. And it was also the work of the minor that allowed for that movement. Because you'd find a minor reference here, a minor reference there, and when they all come together, they give you a sense of an existence, which would have been easily erased if one were working within one discipline only. Now, at this stage, I want to propose multiple readings of the minor as it relates to the research on Charlotte Maximilians. And also reflect on aspects of freedom struggles that have largely been cited but never rendered thinkable within the broader narratives of liberation struggle. In this context, I invoke 4 readings of the minor. The first reading takes on a descriptive tone. The second, issues of positionality. The third, relationality. The fourth, restlessness. In each of these readings, the minor invokes modes of inquiry that take into account the different threads of freedom struggles. And I keep returning back to the idea of freedom struggles. For me, really, I think the discourse around liberation struggle has flattened the debate a bit. There's something about the transition from liberation to the transition from freedom struggle, because we grew up, the talk was really about freedom struggle. And at some point, that is kind of replaced. There's a general receptiveness to the idea of liberation struggle. And on restlessness, which is the last mode of reading, that directs attention to the potentialities that the minor holds for rethinking questions that are often cited and never explored. I've confirmed, I've already pointed out that really we have those aspects of human experience, such as experiencing a figure like Käte. We are incapable of experiencing her within the context of the questions that animate academic disciplines in South Africa. I have to be emphatic about that. And this, for me, returns us to what Gary Minkley used to call the concept of the recurring past. That there's this idea of that which once occurred, reoccurring at times. But I want to take a slighter digression from the idea, right? The idea of that which recurs in the context where one invokes the idea of freedom struggles now. What would it mean to imagine the idea, the debate about freedom struggle recurring now, if you like? For me, it's more of a tactical shift from an established norm that this is what freedom struggle means, but at the same time being attentive to the nuances of that when it is evoked now. The minor residues and the minor reference and its residues cites conceptions of intellectuals that fail to engage the intellectual labor of women. I've cited that already. Now, how do we think about the idea of the minor in the context where we have to articulate the problems of our times? Now, the most enduring question of our time being the collective, the effort to achieve a better world, as I have indicated earlier on, but also ideas about co-creation of a just, caring, and habitable world. These are the new visions of struggles that animate one's intellectual investment. But understanding that articulations of these questions have a history, it is necessary at this stage to invoke a debate about the sides of struggles that once offered alternative visions of freedom struggles. So I'm always kind of holding on to this idea of the minor, allowing us the latitude to return to some of those questions. For you'd have the major wave about a major debate, but the minor is holding on there. It's that which is never taken as that which animates, and yet the residue that I'm invoking here, it is that which has the potential in its own time, in its own pace, to begin to push an alternative vision. And in this case, I want to think of the idea about the sides of the struggle. The most accessible and immediate side for me is that of the university. And I want to be specific, UWC and UFH, the University of Fort Hare, where I am currently working. Universities play a crucial role in setting the tone for public conversations that reflect on societal issues. They play a crucial role in opening up spaces and in facilitating conversations on issues that affect the world. In the mid-1990s, public lectures were a constant feature of my learning experience at UWC. And I still recall quite vividly, public conversation at that time were reflecting on South Africa's newly acquired status as a democratic state. People were still grappling with the meanings embedded in the idea of a democratic state. The site of the university, especially the library auditorium and the Great Hall, were the two spaces where public lectures were often hosted. So I'm trying to think of sites of liberation, sites of struggles. There were other contested sites on campus that marked the intersections of worker struggles, community struggles, as well as those of students who were contesting state power and control. These are struggles that date back to the 70s, when the Motterdam Road, now the Robert Sobukwe, the game reserve where the university is located, the railway line were physical markers of sites of freedom. They were visual marks of the physical landscaping, liberation, freedom struggle, inscribing itself in specific landmarks. So there's something about revisiting those landmarks and begin to see what else is there, what is left of those sites of liberation, both in the literal sense and figuratively. Maybe one would begin to ignite some kind of agitation around the idea of freedom struggle. In the mid-1990s, as undergraduate students, we were treated to a series of conversations about narratives that weave together community struggles and the idea of UWC as the Bush University. Debates were centering around what it means to study in a Bush University. These would be minor conversations among the students, right? Among ourselves, these are the conversations that we're having among ourselves. That what does it mean to study at Bush and not in those other well-off universities? And then would ask, what distinguished UWC from the rest of universities in South Africa? Public debates on campus also ranged from debates on transitions that were taking place in the country. On the political front, a major debate within the ranks of the African National Congress at that time had to do with the difficulty of transitioning from a liberation movement to a political party. That is where I pick up the texture from freedom struggles, but now the mid-90s, the debates are about transitioning from a liberation movement to a political party. This debate remained marginal in the broader scale of debates at the time. Now, owing to a culture of open public debates, the University of the Western Cape has a record of that lecture, a conversation that was led by the head of the policy of the ANC at that time, Ma Bridget Mabandla, who at that time was leading the policy committee of the ANC, where she deliberated at the library auditorium, highlighting the invincibility of change, right? This occurred as some among activists expressed concerns about the change and what these changes meant for a revolutionary struggle. In this marginal conversation, I suspect that questions of freedom were rerouted, I argue. Questions about freedom struggles were rerouted and articulated as questions of liberation. So there's a tactical shift from freedom to liberation. That's where I pick up the flattening of the debate in that context. While these conversations occurred on the ground, residues of these were also felt in minor references punctuated in projects of nation building such as the Truth and Reconciliation. So there's a whole archive of human experience, of conceptions of freedom that remain unaccounted for, that are very much a part of the repositories that have now been flattened, that have now become part of records of liberation. And then the tone of those records set a different understanding to the overarching curatorial code that gave us the concept of the Liberation Archive. So there's something to work with minor articulations of the archive. It is those things that get articulated here and there, and yet are not the overarching narrative that frame understandings of these archives. And I've already started on this one, the Liberation Archive, which for me is yet another side, conceptions of the archive itself. I wish to draw attention to the Archive of Liberation. So I also wish to register the unease with which I use the term liberation struggle, for I suspect that the term liberation struggle reflects the conflation of two different things, right? So I've already alluded to that. So what I'm trying to get at is that when one pays attention, is attentive to the language, the discourses that are kind of embraced as the overarching understanding, kind of statements that form broader understanding and perspectives of liberation, speak a different language to the actual kind of contents of records of the time. So there's something to work with there, and that's where, for me, the idea of revisiting the debate about public intellectuals, for me, that's where I ask myself, if there was this easy flattening of the debate, where are our intellectuals? Right? And that's where, for me, the idea of thinking through the question of intellectuals, through the actual work of doing, centering the actual work of doing intellectual labor as the basis to begin to reignite and interrogate these founded notions of liberation. That's where I talk about the dropping of the ball, right? The easy transition from freedom struggle to liberation struggle. I see that as the dropping of the ball, where the overall objectives are set in the records, when you visit the records of the liberation movements, but the ushering in of the new democratic state registers a shift from the goal of total liberation and focuses on the seizure of state power, which was the overriding narrative of the 80s. Right? So there's something to work with there in that tactical shift from freedom struggles, calls for freedom struggles, and also by the 80s, it had toned down, the political discourse would have toned down to focusing attention on the seizure of state power as that which animates a new round of thinking about freedom struggles. So I say within the short space of time between the late 1980s and 1990s, the practices of freedom struggles that developed in preceding decades were now being channeled to serve in the call to mobilize for seizure of state power. This conflation would later shape, I argue, the coding and the curation of liberation struggle. So the coding and the curation, the curatorial practice that shaped the making of the archive takes tone from that flattening of the debate. Do we still have time? Oh, we still have time. So, is that we have? Yeah, only about 2. Perfect, cool. And now, as